I remember the days before everything unraveled as if they belonged to another lifetime. Evelyn and I had been married for 6 years, and from an outsider's view, our relationship seemed nearly flawless. We both poured our time and love into building a home together. When we decided to start a family, it felt like the final piece of a long-constructed puzzle was sliding into place. Our marriage wasn't without its hurdles, though. My job often kept me away for weeks at a time, and there was an unspoken loneliness between us that we never fully addressed. But I believed we were solid enough to weather anything life threw our way. So when Evelyn announced she was pregnant, I was overjoyed. The idea of becoming a father reignited a sense of purpose in me, and I threw myself into preparations. We spent hours picking out baby names, painting the nursery, and planning for our future as a family of 3. I even arranged to work closer to home so I could be more present for Evelyn and the baby. For months, it seemed like everything was on a perfect path. Little did I know, cracks were already forming beneath the surface. The day our daughter was born felt like a scene out of a nostalgic family painting. Not quite the picture-perfect image on a magazine cover, but close enough. Evelyn lay in the hospital bed nursing our newborn daughter while her mother and mine stood on either side, beaming with pride. Newborns aren't typically adorable in the traditional sense, but to parents and grandparents, they are perfect. I watched as our daughter's blotchy red skin faded to a soft pink. The waxy residue from birth had been wiped away, and even the odd shape of her head had rounded into a gentle, angelic softness. She was beautiful, and I couldn't deny it. I had a strong feeling she'd grow up to look like Evelyn, my wife of 6 years and, until recently, the love of my life. I watched quietly as Evelyn breastfed our daughter, both grandmothers eagerly offering advice she didn't need. Evelyn had taken to nursing naturally, likely due to the parenting classes we attended, which covered breastfeeding and newborn care in meticulous detail. As I stepped aside, a nurse entered the room with another woman in tow. "This is Miss Ryland from administration," the nurse said, her name tag unreadable from where I stood. "She's here to help you with the birth certificate application." In any other setting, a woman nursing her baby while others handled paperwork might seem odd, but in this context, it felt completely normal. "Take your time," Miss Ryland said with a kind smile. "Finish feeding your baby, and once you're ready, just fill in the highlighted sections. Most of the information is already in your hospital records, like your birth date and birthplace. We'll need both of your full names, Evelyn's maiden name, your ages, and a few other details. We'll handle the rest and send it to the county clerk's office. You'll receive a copy of the birth certificate in the mail within a couple of weeks." With that, Miss Ryland excused herself and left. "Why don't you fill out the paperwork, Darius?" Evelyn asked, glancing at me with a small smile. "I'm a little preoccupied at the moment." I didn't return her smile. "No, I think I'll let you handle it later when you're free," I said evenly. "Besides, maybe we should wait for the DNA test results before I go signing anything as the father. If this were a movie, you'd hear the sharp scratch of a record needle halting the music." Everything stopped. 3 of the 4 women froze in shock, mouths hanging open. The only one who didn't react was the baby, whose feeding had been interrupted. Her startled cry filled the silence, barely covering the collective gasps. Evelyn's mother spoke first. "Are you out of your mind, Darius? Why would you even say something like that?" Her eyes darted to Evelyn, who had gone from stunned disbelief to confusion and then to something closer to fury. "Are you serious right now?" Evelyn said, eyes narrowing. "You think I'd have someone else's baby? Is that what you think of me after everything we've been through?" Her lips twitched, trying to force a grin. "This has to be a joke. April Fools, right? Yeah, that's it. It's April 1st, and you're pulling a prank on all of us." But her body language betrayed her words. Her shoulders tensed, and her breath caught in her throat. I shook my head, my eyes locked on hers. "No joke, Evelyn." "I'm serious," I said, my voice cold as steel. "There's a real possibility I'm not the father." Her eyes widened, disbelief giving way to outrage. "How could you possibly think I'd cheat on you? Name one single time I've ever given you reason to believe I was with someone else." "Typical," I muttered, ignoring her question. "Deny, deny, deny. It's your favorite move, and you're doing it with a straight face. Honestly, I'm impressed." I turned to Evelyn's mother. I should probably move the car seat from my car to yours. It might be best if you take Evelyn and the baby home today. We always said we didn't need help, but she might need you around for a bit, especially since I won't be." I had just started for the door when my mother's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Stop right there, Darius Monroe Whitner." Her words hit me like a jolt. I stopped mid-stride, my jaw tightening as I turned to face her. Both mothers exchanged tense glances, their faces a mixture of shock and concern. Evelyn, meanwhile, was now openly sobbing, clutching the baby to her chest. "No, you can't leave me," she cried, her voice cracking. "You can't leave me and baby Livia. She's your daughter. You're her father." I sighed, glancing at her with a grim expression. "I'm supposed to be her father." "Yeah, but being supposed to doesn't make it true, Evelyn. We both know there's a difference." My mother, her patience clearly at its limit, stormed up to me and jabbed me in the chest with her finger. Her eyes blazed as she yanked me forward by the front of my shirt like she had when I was a boy. "What is wrong with you, Darius? You can't just walk away from this child. You were thrilled when Evelyn told us she was pregnant. Remember all the baby books you read, the crib you built, the changing table you put together, the nursery you painted pink and yellow with all those little animals on the walls? Every week you brought home a new toy she wouldn't be able to play with for years. So what happened? What changed?" She eyed me like she was searching for an answer on my face. "I had a revelation," I replied. "I'm not as sure as I used to be, and I'm guessing you've noticed something's off too." Evelyn's mother nodded grimly. "Yeah, we noticed. You haven't held Livia once, not even a glance at her. We figured maybe you were just adjusting to it all, but now I'm wondering." I straightened my shoulders, speaking with quiet intensity. "If she's my child, I'll be everything she needs in a father. But I'm not bonding with a child who isn't mine. I'm not doing it. Not yours." Ity's voice rose, incredulous. "What are you even talking about, Darius? I'll provide for her if she's mine, but if not, then Julian Rosewood can step up and be a father to his own child," I said with force at the mention of that name. Evelyn's sobs turned into a gasp. "Julian, are you serious right now? We've never been involved. Darius, you're insane if you believe that." I moved closer, standing at the foot of her hospital bed. My mother and Yvette shared uneasy looks, their gazes flicking from me to Evelyn. "Really, Evelyn? You're going to stand there and deny it?" I asked. "You had an affair with him for 6 months. It only stopped when you realized you were pregnant. I even know he told you to make sure I never found out." Her face paled as she shook her head, panic creeping into her voice. "No, we didn't do anything. Who told you that lie?" I locked eyes with her and dropped my voice to an ear whisper. "Julian Rosewood told me himself." Before Ida could react, and maybe because of her exhaustion and distress, Evelyn blurted out, "Julian would never tell you that. He promised." Ida's eyes darted back and forth between her daughter and me, her face shifting as she caught on to Evelyn's slip-up. "I need to know exactly what you know," she demanded firmly. I took a breath, turning my attention to Evelyn. "Julian spilled everything. He confessed it all," I said, watching her closely. "But to be fair, he was under a lot of pressure at the time. It all just came out in the middle of his screaming." "That's ridiculous," Evelyn shot back, her voice shaking. "Julian was fine when he called me yesterday to check on me and the baby." Silence. Her words echoed in the room like a firecracker cracking through the air and landing on everyone in earshot. Evelyn's exhaustion from childbirth must have dulled her awareness, or maybe she didn't realize the weight of what she just admitted. I slumped back, looking stunned. My mother's eyes widened as she glanced at me, then Evelyn, slowly putting it all together. "So you're still in contact with your old friend?" I said, my voice low but pointed. "Did he give you more tips on how to keep me in the dark about him being the possible father of this baby?" Evelyn's face crumpled, and she broke down into sobs. Her cries came so suddenly and so violently that 2 nurses rushed into the room. "We were so careful," she wept, shoulders shaking. "There was no way you could have known. No one knew." "She's just a little overwhelmed," I told the first nurse, who was shooting daggers at me with her eyes. I suppose my tone came off colder than I intended. We're just discussing potential names to put on the birth certificate application, I added, flashing a tight, hollow smile. The nurse's gaze lingered on me, her suspicion growing more visible. Well, it seems she's expecting me to fill in my name, I continued, but I think I'd rather wait until we know for sure if I'm the father or if it's the guy she was seeing when she got pregnant. The nurse's face shifted as she began piecing things together. Her eyes softened toward Evelyn as she placed a hand on her arm. Miss Whitner, let's calm down, okay? Remember your breathing techniques from labor, she said, glancing at the other nurse. Ruby will grab something to help you relax if needed, but let's try natural methods first. We don't want anything passing into your milk, right? Come on, deep breaths. Inhale with me. As I watched the nurse soothe Evelyn, I didn't notice my mom and Yvette moving closer until my mother's sharp whisper caught me off guard. You need to explain what's going on, she hissed, her voice sharp but quiet. Startled, I turned to face her. My mom rarely spoke like that, but this was the second time she'd done it today. That alone told me how serious things had gotten. I want to know everything, Yvette added, arms folded. The full story. What, when, and how. This is completely out of the blue. I let out a tired laugh, glancing at both of them. You two are asking the wrong person, I replied, irritation bubbling up in my chest. I'm not the one who was sneaking around. I'm just the fool standing here connecting the dots. I motioned toward Evelyn with a wave of my hand. She was seeing someone at work while we were trying to have a baby. At least one other man besides me. I can't say for sure if there were more. Evelyn pulled herself together with surprising speed, her sobs morphing into shallow, steady breaths. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were fierce now. We were so careful, she muttered, her voice cracking with desperation. How did you find out? Her words caught the attention of my mom and IET, both of whom looked at me expectantly, clearly eager for more answers. You were careful, I agreed with a nod. I'll give you that. I had no idea. Neither did anyone else. I paused, letting the weight of that admission hang in the air. But Julian, being the charming fool he is, just couldn't help himself. Evelyn's brow furrowed, and her lips parted slightly. What are you talking about? Julian was trying to impress Ruby Graves, I said, watching Evelyn's face twist. She knew Ruby well. You remember Ruby, don't you? She's worked with you for years. Her husband, Scott, is in our social circle. Evelyn's eyes darted to the floor, her mouth pressing into a tight line. Well, I continued, Julian had his eye on Ruby, and apparently he got pretty close. Ruby told him she was scared of being caught. She didn't trust him to keep his mouth shut, so to prove he could keep a secret, he went and spilled details about his other conquests. He even name-dropped a few women from work, some of them married, some not. The one before you was Sandy. She backed out after a few months when her husband started getting suspicious. Then it was you, Evelyn. 6 months with you until you got pregnant. He told Ruby that you were hoping I'd be the father so you could avoid all this mess. Stop it, Evelyn hissed, hands trembling as she gripped the bed rails. Oh, now you want it to stop, I said, laughing bitterly. Maybe you should have thought about that before running around with Julian. He bragged to Ruby, Evelyn. He laid it all out for her, made it clear that you told him to keep quiet because you were afraid I'd leave you. Silence hung in the air like a fog. It looked like she'd been struck across the face, and my mom's eyes darted toward Evelyn, wide and sharp with disbelief. And Ruby, my mom asked. How did she end up confessing? She didn't mean to, I said, letting out a short, humorous chuckle. Apparently, Ruby gets vocal. Not like Evelyn, though, I smirked, ignoring the whines from both mothers. Ruby likes to use names, real specific names. According to Scott, one night she shouted, "Give it to me, Julian. I love it." Ivy's face went pale. My mother's hand covered her mouth as if that might somehow block out what she just heard. Scott connected the dots immediately, I said, leaning forward with my hands on my hips. He knew Julian, knew his reputation, knew his name didn't sound anything like Scott. He confronted Ruby, and just like that, she spilled everything. She told him the whole story over tears and apologies. Scott told me all about it later over drinks. He knew from the moment he heard it that something was wrong. You can't mix up Scott with Julian. Heidi turned to Evelyn, her voice low and hard. "Tell me it's not true," she said, almost pleading. But Evelyn just sat there, eyes darting everywhere except at Heidi. "There's more," I said, pushing forward. After Evelyn, Julian moved on to marry Richfield. Her husband, Ethan, works in law enforcement, so that's a whole other mess. Ethan started getting suspicious when Mary kept working late and showing up late to daycare pickups. It got bad enough that Ethan started asking questions. He's been keeping quiet for a week, though, waiting. He didn't want to do anything to add stress to Evelyn while she was still pregnant. But now that the baby's here, I'm guessing he's done playing nice. Heidi's face was ghost white. "So you're telling me that this Julian Rosewood was involved with multiple women, including my daughter, and there's a chance Livia is his?" she asked, her voice tight with controlled rage. Her breath shuddered as she backed away from Evelyn, her disappointment visible in every movement. "Yes," I responded bluntly. "And Julian has no clue, or maybe he does and just doesn't care about the wreckage he's left behind." Silence took over the room like a storm cloud. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my mom finally broke the tension. "So what's the next step?" she asked, her voice low but firm. I sighed, feeling the weight of every choice I'd made so far pressing down on me. "I've already submitted a DNA test. I spoke to the head nurse the day after the baby was born. Since Evelyn and I are married, I didn't need her consent to test the baby." I rubbed my hands together, trying to work out the frustration boiling in my chest. "I paid extra to have it expedited. 2 to 3 days for the results." Heidi shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Evelyn before looking back at me. "Do you think you could find it in your heart to forgive her and move on, even if you're not the baby's biological father?" I noticed the change. She didn't call Livia by her name. She just said, "the baby." It was subtle, but it stuck with me. Heidi had always used Livia's name before. She was perceptive like that. She could probably read me better than most people, and I could see she still held out hope that I'd forgive Evelyn and stay. I glanced over at my mom. She didn't say a word, but I could tell she already knew where I stood. She wasn't happy about it, but she knew. "To be honest, I'm not sure I can," I admitted. "Even if I am her biological father." My eyes settled on Evelyn, who avoided my gaze. "I've had just over a week to process this, and every minute of it has been miserable. This wasn't a one-time mistake like a drunken fling. This was a 6-month affair. That's half a year of secrets and lies. I can't trust her anymore. She didn't just betray me, she disrespected our whole marriage. Worse, she risked getting pregnant by another man while we were actively trying to have a baby together. She smiled in my face and told our families it was our decision to start a family, knowing full well she was still sneaking around with Julian." I stayed quiet, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Have you considered counseling?" My mom interjected. It sounded like she was trying to head off any arguments from IET before they could start. "Couples therapy could help you two rebuild, even if it takes time. And don't forget about Livia. It's not her fault. That little girl will need a father, whether she's yours or not. You could still be her dad." I sighed again, rubbing my hands down my face. "Mom, like I said, I don't think therapy is going to fix this." My voice grew sharper than I intended. "Honestly, I'm just trying to understand where I went wrong as a husband. There had to be something I did or didn't do that pushed Evelyn to do this. She wasn't looking to replace me with Julian. She knew he'd never commit to her. He's a serial womanizer, everyone at her job knows it, and I'm sure she did too." I shook my head, frustrated. I'm trying not to say everything that's on my mind because right now neither of them deserves my anger, but I'm close to snapping. Real close. Aside from physical attraction, or maybe the thrill of it, I can't see any reason she'd throw away everything we built. I thought our relationship was strong. They both stayed quiet as I kept going, the words flowing like water from a broken faucet. "You can imagine how shattered I've been since I found out. Like you said, Mom, I was so excited about being a father. I was ready for it. Then out of nowhere, everything fell apart. My whole world just collapsed. And honestly, at this point, I almost hope I'm not the father." Both women looked at me, wide-eyed and stunned. "That way I wouldn't have to deal with being a part-time dad," I admitted. I'm not sure I can handle being in Evelyn's orbit for the next 18 years. If Livia is mine, it's going to take a lot of therapy for me to even figure out how to be around Evelyn. Just then, a nurse stepped out of the hospital room, glancing at me. "Mr. Whitner," she said, walking closer. "Your wife would like to speak with you. She mentioned she knows you're still here, and since her mother hasn't returned, she figured you'd still be nearby." I glanced at the nurse, noticing a flicker of sympathy in her eyes. But as I moved to step forward, she raised a hand to stop me. "If you do go in," she said carefully, "please try to stay calm. I understand you're upset, but we want to avoid stressing her out. We'd prefer not to use sedation, especially since she's scheduled for discharge this afternoon. Extra medication could pass into her milk, and I know from your childbirth classes that you understand how important early breast milk is for a newborn's immune system." I nodded slowly, her words cutting through the fog of my thoughts. She was appealing to me as a potential father, and whether I liked it or not, I still cared about Livia's well-being. "Maybe you should go talk to her," my mom suggested. "If that, and I will grab some coffee. Hand me your car keys, and we'll move the car seat." She paused, her eyes softening just a little. "Oh, and before you leave, stop by the nursery and take a good look at Livia. I think she looks a lot like you did when you were born." "Wishful thinking, Mom," I muttered, giving her a glance. "Or are you just seeing what you want to see?" She shrugged, clearly unhappy. I knew that if Livia was my daughter, my mom would be involved in raising her no matter what happened between Evelyn and me. She was already attached. I walked into the hospital room, and as soon as Evelyn saw me, she broke down crying again. Her shoulders shook, and her breathing came in short, sharp bursts. "You must hate me," she sobbed. "No, I don't hate you," I replied, gripping the edge of the bed frame. "That's the problem." I struggled to keep my voice steady. "I hate what you did. I'm furious, so angry I can barely think straight, but I don't hate you." I exhaled slowly, clenching my fists. "Do you really want to talk now, or do you need a few more days to figure out how you're going to explain this?" "I don't need days." Evelyn started, but I cut her off. "You've had 9 months to think about what you'd say if I ever found out about you and Julian Rosewood." My voice shook when I said his name. "Julian Rosewood," I repeated slowly, letting the name linger in the air. "I thought I was having our baby, not his." Evelyn's eyes shot up to meet mine. "It is your baby," she cried. "I might be a lot of things, but I know who the father is." "Do you?" I snapped, because I checked my work schedule. I was offshore during the first week of July, most of it anyway. I got back at the end of the week, and we were intimate right away. "I thought that's when you got pregnant." "That's what I told the guys at work." I took a step forward, my eyes locked on hers. "But what about the weeks before that, Evelyn? Did you have him over while I was gone? Did you sleep with him in our bed?" I asked, my voice rising. "Not that it matters where it happened. It matters that it happened." "No," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "He never came to the house except for work barbecues. We were careful. I wouldn't risk a neighbor seeing him there." "Careful, huh? Not careful enough to avoid getting pregnant." I muttered coldly. Evelyn buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. "I don't know why I did it," she said softly. "I was lonely. You were gone all the time. We started talking, and before I realized it, we were close." I shook my head, laughing bitterly. "You thought that was the best option?" Evelyn looked stunned, and I hoped she wouldn't shut down before I got more answers. "So you cheated on me for about 4 months before getting pregnant, and then kept it going for another 2 months after that?" I pressed, trying to push the conversation forward. She nodded slowly, her face flushed with shame. "I suspected I might be pregnant, but I didn't want to stop until I was sure," she admitted, eyes downcast. "I justified it by telling myself that if I was already pregnant, it didn't matter if I kept seeing him." She winced, clearly realizing how bad that sounded. "So Julian ended things after you told him about the baby?" I asked. "Yeah," she admitted softly. "He didn't want to risk you finding out and having to deal with being responsible if the baby was his." "So you two discussed your options, huh?" I said, folding my arms. Evelyn nodded again, her voice quieter than before. "Yes, We both figured you'd never suspect that Livia wasn't yours, she confessed. And honestly, there was a good chance she wasn't his, especially since you came home that first week in July. We were together constantly that week, and I didn't see Julian at all when you were home. I tilted my head, letting the realization sink in. So you had a whole relationship with Julian while I was offshore working to support us in the life we planned together? My voice was thick with bitterness. Was it out of resentment because I wasn't around? I cut myself off before saying something cruel. No, it wasn't like that, she said quickly, shaking her head. It wasn't emotional. It was just physical. I was lonely, and I felt, I don't know, desire. Fire. And Julian was there. We only met when you were away. We'd meet at his place 3 or 4 times a week. I didn't stay overnight every time. I tried to make it seem like I was home most of the time. We were careful not to be obvious at work. No affection in public, no flirting where anyone could see. Her words felt rehearsed, like she'd already practiced this justification in her head 100 times. And no, she added, as if reading my mind. He's not better in bed. He's not better at anything. We didn't do anything together that you and I haven't done. Her eyes flickered up to meet mine, searching for some sign of understanding. He was just there when you weren't. It was fun, exciting. That's the best way I can put it. And no, I didn't do it to get back at you. It was selfish. It was something I did for me. Her honesty felt like a slap to the face. She didn't even try to sugarcoat it. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my emotions in check. If you were only mine when I was around, then you were never really mine at all, I said, locking my eyes on hers. You were my wife, but his mistress. You were so careful not to get caught, but then you got pregnant. My voice dripped with disdain. I guess you never thought about what would happen if I found out later, like say if our oldest kid had a different blood type than me or didn't look like our other kids. I guess you figured I'd just accept it, or maybe you'd try again later with Julian and give him a second kid too, huh? No, Evelyn said frantically, her eyes wild with panic. She shook her head as if trying to erase my words from existence. I swear. I promised I'd never cheat on you again. And I knew that once you bonded with Livia, you'd never leave her, even if she wasn't biologically yours. Just look at how devoted you've been to her already. She sniffled, wiping at her eyes. Even Julian agrees. Points for you, I guess, I said sarcastically. You and Julian talked about all this, huh? About how you'd play me like a fool and make sure I stayed in the dark. Yesterday when he called to check on you and the baby, I'm guessing that's exactly what you discussed. How to manage me. Her eyes darted to the side, her fingers fidgeting with the blanket. I'd seen that look on her face before. It was the look of someone caught and scrambling to avoid the consequences. And let me tell you something, I said coldly, stepping closer to the bed. The key word in everything you just said was. I was invested in being Livia's daddy, but not anymore. Both our moms noticed that I haven't held her once since she was born. I haven't changed her diaper, swaddled her, or even really looked at her for more than a second. I leaned forward, looking her dead in the eyes. If the DNA test says I'm her father, then fine, I'll step up. I'll be her dad. But until then, I'm done playing house with you. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. I was too far gone for that. Let me ask you something, Evelyn, I said slowly. Did it ever really matter to you whether I was Livia's father or not? She hesitated but didn't deny it. Her lips parted, and after a long pause, she admitted, Of course I wanted you to be the father. But once I found out I was pregnant, I just wanted the baby. I knew she'd be beautiful, and you wouldn't suspect anything. You and Julian don't look that different. Same hair color, similar build. You'd be her daddy, and it wouldn't matter. A bitter laugh escaped my chest, sharp and hollow. You know, I started working closer to home for you. I stopped taking offshore jobs and took a pay cut. I gave up those big bonus checks. I did that for you because I thought that's what you wanted. I shook my head, fury boiling just beneath my skin. If me being away was such a problem, you should have just said something. All you had to do was ask. Everything I did was for you. Evelyn's sobs grew louder, but this time I felt nothing. Well, that's about to change, I said. If I'm not the father, I'm going back offshore. I'll stay out there as long as I need to. I'll find a woman who actually wants to be with me and only me, not someone who can't keep her vows or her legs closed while I'm gone. Her tears kept falling, but I'd stopped caring. But I need you to help with the baby, she sobbed. We're a family. What about us? These past 7 months, I've been loyal. I haven't looked at another man since then. We could try counseling. We could fix this. Right now, I'm not sure there's an US, I said coldly. We'll figure it out if the DNA test says I'm her father, but for now, I'm done here. I glanced around the room. I've already packed up my stuff. The things that matter to me are gone. Her eyes widened in shock. Where will you go? She asked, her voice small and trembling. I rented an apartment last week, I said plainly. I waited for Livia to be born before leaving, but I'm gone now. I stepped toward the door. Aiti will stay with you, and maybe my mom will help too. She's hoping Livia is her grandchild, but we'll see. I didn't look back. Her sobs followed me out the door. I nearly ran into Yvette and my mom, both of them lingering near the doorway. It was clear they'd been eavesdropping. Yeah, I heard you, so sue me. Aiti muttered bitterly. She glanced at me with a pleading look. But don't give up, Darius. There's still a chance for reconciliation, especially if Livia is your daughter. I turned to her, my patience finally gone. Did you actually listen, Yvette, or did you miss the part where Evelyn never apologized for cheating on me? I snapped. She didn't feel guilt. She didn't feel remorse. She's been justifying it since I walked in. Her logic is that she was lonely and aroused, so I'm supposed to accept that and move on? It's disgusting. My mom stepped in, trying to ease the tension. We moved the car seat and secured it, she said gently. I'm going to pack a bag and stay for a few days. Even if you're not the father, Evelyn has been like a daughter to me for the last 6 years. I can't just abandon her. Not yet, at least. But don't get me wrong, she added, her tone firmer. I don't condone what she did. I'm angry too. If she hadn't just had a baby, I think Aiti and I would both tell her just how foolish she's been. I nodded, appreciating her honesty. When they asked, I shared the location of my new apartment, but I didn't mention that I'd already spoken to a lawyer and taken steps to protect my share of our assets. I had settled our credit card debts, secured the investment accounts, and had the lawyer prepare divorce papers citing infidelity. Even though infidelity isn't recognized as a cause for divorce in our state, it felt necessary. Evelyn would be stuck at home for a while after childbirth, but I didn't trust her not to meddle with our finances online. I had to take precautions. I was almost certain our marriage was beyond saving. Whatever small doubt I'd had based on the happiness we'd once shared was gone. Trusting her again was out of the question. On my way to the new apartment, I called up Scott, needing some company and a drink. I planned to take a few weeks off work after the baby was born to help Evelyn adjust, sort of like a male version of maternity leave. But right now, being alone wasn't something I wanted. Scott had a flexible schedule since he worked for his father-in-law's company. He agreed to meet me at a bar. His situation was much better than mine. After Ruby's confession, he'd been rethinking his marriage too. You talked to Evelyn, I take it? Scott asked as we sat down with our drinks. I nodded and told him about everything that went down, every ugly detail. I've already consulted the same lawyer you did, he said, taking a sip of his beer. Fortunately for me, Ruby's father made her sign a prenuptial agreement before we got married. He wanted to protect his business. She has some stock, but it doesn't pay dividends, and she doesn't have any real influence in the company. She'll keep the stock, but I'll get nearly everything else. We talked about this before, so Scott already knew Evelyn would be entitled to half of our shared assets, and unfortunately, that was no small amount. We'd both contributed financially to the marriage, with Evelyn earning a good salary. I was hoping to create enough tension to avoid paying her alimony, and I figured Yvette might help with that. As for child support, that only mattered if the baby was mine, and I still had serious doubts about that. I'm going to pay for this, I muttered, running a hand over my face. The courts are going to punish me for doing nothing wrong. Scott nodded grimly. Ron and I went to see Marcus Duval, you know, Dana's husband, and we told him about her affair with Julian. He shook his head, his expression still one of disbelief. As expected, he was furious. Ron, being a cop, warned him not to do anything reckless. I nodded. Don't blame him for being mad. I'm mad too. Yeah, well, Marcus was mad at us too, Scott said. Thought we were cowards for letting Julian get away with it. Called us weak for not confronting him right away. I raised an eyebrow. And what did Ron say to that? Scott grinned. Ron told him, who said anything about letting that idiot off easy? Then he told Marcus, don't do anything stupid that'll get you caught. He reminded him that Julian isn't worth going to jail over. I chuckled darkly, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on me. Marcus may be hot-tempered, but he's not stupid. Exactly, Scott agreed. He said fine. I just need to make sure I don't get caught when someone deals with Julian. We both laughed, the kind of dark humor you use to keep from falling apart. Yeah, I said, still laughing. We all know something has to be done about that idiot, but I have to be careful. No rash moves, and castrating him isn't the answer. Scott raised an eyebrow. You've lost it, man. You can't just walk away from this thinking it's over. Even if he can't have more kids, he still has financial responsibilities. He's still accountable for wrecking marriages. Yours, mine, Marcus's, and maybe Ron's too. Yeah, I know. Ron might stay with Mary for now because of their kids, but that depends on how she reacts when he confronts her tonight. Well, Julian's lies will fall apart as soon as the women start warning him, Scott said, grinning slightly. He's not going to stick around for long. His problem is he's too easy to track. People underestimate how hard it is to disappear completely. He's in trouble, trust me. Yeah, I bet there are more women we don't even know about, I added. If we've already uncovered 4 women he's been with, there are definitely more. It's like shaking a haystack and 4 needles fall out. You know the rest of it's full of them too. Scott laughed at that. That's a solid metaphor. As for dealing with Julian, I added with a smirk, I'd prefer he keeps at least 1 testicle intact. Scott blinked. Why? Just 1. Simple, I replied, grinning darkly. If he loses both, he can still get hormone replacement therapy and keep having sex. But if you leave him with 1 and make sure it's damaged, he'll live with constant discomfort. It's a longer-lasting punishment without being too extreme. Plus, it'll mess with him psychologically. Scott burst out laughing, already picturing it. Man, I have to tell Ron and Marcus that one. They'll love it. 2 days later, I stopped by the house where Evelyn and I used to live. I answered the door, her eyes hard and suspicious. You didn't waste any time, did you? She muttered. What do you want? Evelyn got the divorce papers this morning, I said, feeling a mix of guilt and relief. Aiti's face softened, but only slightly. Lately, she's been crying non-stop since then, she said, arms crossed. The only time she's okay is when she's caring for Livia. I can't really blame you, but I thought you'd hold off a little longer. I thought about it, I admitted, but there's no point in waiting. She's upset now, sure, but she's already spent 6 months making a fool of me. I'm done giving her the benefit of the doubt. Eddie's eyes narrowed. Is there any chance for reconciliation? Maybe counseling could help. I shook my head slowly. I was already convinced there was no future for us as a couple, and this just confirms it. I handed her a folded envelope. Her eyes darted to it, and when she realized what it was, her breath caught. Is this? Yeah, I said flatly. The paternity test results. The baby isn't mine. Her hands trembled as she took the envelope, and when she opened it and read the results, tears streamed down her face. Her shoulders sagged, and I could see the weight of shattered hopes settling on her. I'm sorry, Aita said quietly. She nodded, unable to speak. After a moment, she pulled me in for a hug, and I could feel her heartbreak in her chest. I'm sorry too, she whispered. She let me go, wiped her eyes, and turned to break the news to Evelyn. I'd already told my mom, and she was just as heartbroken. She dreamed of being a grandmother, and that dream had been snatched away. She was so angry about Evelyn's betrayal that she refused to be at the house while they waited for the DNA results. She had suffered the same betrayal I had. The whole town was buzzing about Julian Rosewood and his affairs with married women. In the days that followed, Scott, Ron, Marcus, and I confronted our wives, and we didn't hold back. We named him outright, making sure everyone knew none of us liked being called betrayed, but we weren't about to stay quiet. Julian's strategy was simple: brag about past conquests, charm vulnerable women, and exploit the cracks in their marriages. We told our stories, and word got out. The town knew who Julian Rosewood was now. As word of Julian's affairs spread, things got messy fast. Fathers of babies born to women linked to him started demanding paternity tests. Before long, I heard about 2 more kids he'd fathered. Suspicious husbands began questioning their wives, and some couples even sought counseling. The full extent of his betrayal didn't come to light until Julian himself confessed directly to the police. You'd think a guy living the kind of life Julian did would be smart enough to keep his assets liquid, ready to flee at a moment's notice. But no, instead of converting his high income into cash, stocks, or easy-to-move assets, Julian went all in on real estate. He bought multiple properties, furnished his house with extravagant decor, and even displayed valuable artwork on his walls. He had all the hunting and fishing gear you'd expect to see around here, plus a luxury boat decked out for both skiing and fishing. If he'd had any sense, he would have cashed out and disappeared. But no, Julian stayed put. It's hard to vanish when every employer requires your social security number, and once angry husbands start looking for you, it's even harder. Instead of fleeing, he stayed, and he paid for it. A few days after his name started making rounds, Julian was found on the sidewalk near his house, barely conscious. He'd been out for a morning jog when it happened. Another jogger found him strapped up with his arms bound behind his back. She tried to roll him over, but his screams stopped her cold. She called for an ambulance, and when the paramedics arrived, they discovered the worst of it. His groin had been crushed, not bruised, not fractured, crushed. The tool used: a 3-pound sledgehammer. Ron told me about it while we were at the bar with Scott and Marcus. 2 detectives told me if I ever had a 3-pound hammer with mysterious tissue on it, I should toss it in the swamp, he said with a sly grin and a barely concealed smirk. I had nothing to do with what happened to that guy's manhood, but I'm just passing along what the officers told me, Ron added, his wink saying everything his words didn't. Julian claimed he had no idea who attacked him. He remembered his doorbell ringing but couldn't recall if it was late at night or early that morning. It had been dark, and he'd been half asleep. I think they used a taser, he told investigators. They shocked me down there a few times. I remember that. I think there were 2 of them, but I'm not sure. One of them said something about not going after another man's wife, and after that, it was just pain. Desperate to see his attackers brought to justice, Julian listed every woman he'd been with over the past few years, married or otherwise. The list was long, and with so many potential suspects, the investigation became a logistical nightmare. No solid evidence led to any one person, and because the exact time of the attack was unclear, alibis were nearly impossible to confirm. Privately, Ron told me and Scott that the detectives weren't too pressed to solve the case. They think Julian Rosewood got exactly what he deserved, he said with a shrug. After a few months, the investigation went cold. Back at home, Evelyn was granted half of our shared property. The house was sold, and a new family moved in. They had a young daughter, and I wondered if she appreciated the nursery I'd painted with little animal designs. I'd spent hours getting the details just right. Knowing another man's child was growing up there felt like a kick in the teeth. Evelyn moved back to her mother's house with IET. There, at least, she wouldn't be alone. I had no interest in Evelyn's romantic life. She called me once to apologize, probably because IET told her to, but she didn't say what she was apologizing for. Was it for cheating? For getting pregnant by another man? For getting caught? I didn't ask. By that point, I'd already moved on. When she suggested we meet to talk, I declined. She also asked if I'd heard about what happened to Julian and if I had anything to do with it. I only said he got what he deserved and hung up. That was the last time we spoke. After that, everything was handled through our lawyers. I sometimes wondered how much Evelyn would spend trying to legally force Julian to pay child support. Knowing him, he wouldn't do it willingly. She'd eventually get it, sure, but not without draining her own savings to hire a lawyer. Julian was facing similar lawsuits from other women, and I heard the courts were freezing his assets to stop him from selling off his real estate. Between his medical bills, legal fees, and child support obligations, he wouldn't have much left, and that's assuming he could even keep his job. 18 months later, I was standing on the lower deck of the Econ 626 oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. The cool autumn breeze brushed against me, and my lightweight windbreaker kept me warm. It was one of my final visits to the rigs. I'd met someone, a woman named Lily. She was different, quiet strength, steady as the tide. We had a connection, one that I didn't know I needed until it was there. I wasn't sure where things would go with Lily, but for the first time in a long time, I was open to the future. It was time to accept the job offer at headquarters, the one I'd turned down twice before. I was done running from what happened. As I unzipped my jacket, I felt a weight hanging near my belt. It was a familiar weight, one I'd felt for far too long. It didn't make sense that I still had it, but I did. No matter how many times I thought about getting rid of it, I'd held on to it. The weight had been a strange source of comfort, like I'd reclaimed something I'd lost without thinking too much about it. I pulled the heavy hammer from its hiding place. It felt solid in my hand, heavier than I remembered. I stared at it for a moment, then turned toward the sea. The ocean stretched out in front of me, endless and dark. I tightened my grip on the hammer, feeling its cold metal bite into my palm. Then, with one swing, I launched it as far as I could. The splash was distant but satisfying. After I walked out of that hospital room, everything felt like it moved in slow motion. It was like watching my life play out from a distance, as if I were just a bystander, powerless to change anything. I rented a small apartment near the house where Evelyn and I used to live. It was cold, impersonal, and felt more like a motel room than a home. I didn't bother furnishing it. I didn't see the point. If I wasn't at work, I was at the bar, nursing beers and broken pride. I replayed every moment, every conversation, wondering if I'd missed the signs. We were happy, weren't we? Or had that just been my version of the story? I debated seeing Livia again. My mom kept asking, "Have you gone to see the baby yet?" Like it would fix something. But how could I look at that child and not wonder if she was mine? When the paternity test came back, I knew the truth. But still, I went. Not for Evelyn, not for IET, for Livia. I didn't expect a grand reunion. I walked in, and IE handed me the baby without a word. I sat on the couch, holding Livia in my arms. It wasn't the emotional breakthrough I'd expected. I looked at her face, so small and perfect, and all I could see was Julian's betrayal, Evelyn's lies. I held her close, but it didn't change anything. "You're not her father," Ida said quietly, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. "You don't owe anything." I left without looking back. That day, I made the choice to move on. I took the desk job at headquarters and traded offshore shifts for city office life. I met Lily. She didn't pry, didn't push. She listened when I was ready. It's been 3 years since I walked out of that hospital. Evelyn and I never spoke again. Livia is someone else's responsibility now. I still think about her sometimes, but less and less as time passes. As for Julian, well, he got what was coming to him. I'll admit there are nights I think about the hammer. Why did I keep it? Why did I let it go? Maybe I just needed to believe that even after everything fell apart, I still had control. But when I threw it into the sea, it felt like a release, a goodbye to the man I used to be.